The Mafia boss found photos of his Black Maid on his phone. Then he made a choice. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character. Victor Callahan had built his life on control, the kind measured in contracts signed before sunrise, meetings that never ran late, and a mansion that stayed quiet even when the city outside refused to sleep. And on that particular night, somewhere past midnight, he stood alone in his study with only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the glow of his phone lighting his face, scrolling through emails with the detached efficiency that had made him powerful, until his thumb paused without permission, stopping on a folder he did not remember creating, a simple unlabeled album buried among work screenshots and reminders. And when he opened it, time slowed in a way Victor Callahan was not used to, because the screen filled with an image that made no sense to him at first. A woman standing by the back staircase of his home, head lowered, hands folded neatly at her waist, the lighting uneven and unflattering, as if the photo had been taken without intention, without artistry, without pride. And yet he recognized her instantly. Elena Brooks, the maid who arrived every morning before most people in the city finished their first cup of coffee. The woman who moved through his house as if trying not to disturb the air itself. And Victor frowned, not in anger but confusion, swiping to the next photo, then the next, and with each movement of his thumb, a pattern emerged that tightened something unfamiliar in his chest. Elena tying her shoes in the service hallway, Elena sitting on a step during a short break with her lunch balanced carefully on her knees, Elena wiping down a kitchen counter long after it was already clean. None of the images posed, none acknowledged the camera, all captured from a distance that suggested she never knew she was being seen. And that realization unsettled him more than the images themselves, because Victor Callahan prided himself on awareness, on knowing every system that operated under his roof. And yet here were moments he could not account for, taken at angles that implied habit rather than intention, observation rather than malice. And he searched his memory for the act of taking them, but found nothing. No recollection of lifting the phone, no reason for doing so, only the undeniable truth that they existed, saved on his device, cataloged by time and date, like quiet witnesses. And as he leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath his weight, Victor noticed details he had never noticed before. The way Elena's shoulders always seemed slightly tense, the careful distance she kept from mirrors, the way her expression in these unguarded moments was not sad but tired, a tiredness earned through consistency rather than complaint. And for the first time in years, the room felt smaller, not because of fear or threat, but because the walls held something he had overlooked, a life unfolding in the margins of his own. And Victor Callahan, a man accustomed to decisive action, did nothing at all. He simply sat there, phone in hand, eyes fixed on the screen, realizing that power had made many things possible for him, but it had not taught him how to see. And in that silence, surrounded by evidence of a presence he had reduced to routine, he felt the beginning of a question forming, not about Elena Brooks, but about himself. Morning arrived quietly at the Callahan estate, the sky outside still pale as Elena Brooks parked her old sedan at the edge of the long gravel drive, arriving at 5:30 as she always did, because early hours meant fewer eyes and fewer questions, and she preferred it that way, unlocking the service entrance with a key that never quite felt like it belonged to her, stepping into the cool stillness of a house designed to impress people who never noticed who kept it that way. And as she slipped on her work shoes and tied her hair back, Elena moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that being unnoticed was not a flaw but a form of protection. Starting in the kitchen where stainless steel counters reflected fluorescent light and yesterday's silence, wiping surfaces already clean because repetition calmed her thoughts, then moving room to room with a cart that rattled softly only when she let it, measuring her steps, adjusting her breathing, careful not to make the kind of noise that reminded powerful people she existed, because Elena Brooks had learned early in life that visibility often came with a cost, and she had no interest in paying it again. Her days structured by lists she memorized rather than wrote down, dusting shelves, folding linens, replacing fresh flowers in vases taller than she was, always leaving spaces better than she found them while remaining unchanged herself. And when the house began to wake, voices low and distant, she shifted her schedule without being asked, retreating to hallways and stairwells where footsteps echoed but conversations did not, taking her short break near the back staircase where the sunlight reached only in thin lines, sitting on the step with her lunch wrapped carefully in a paper bag, eating slowly because it was the only part of her day she truly owned, unaware that only hours earlier, those same moments had been preserved on a screen she would never see. While upstairs Victor Callahan moved through his morning with the same precision he applied to everything else, showering, dressing in tailored clothes that fit without thought, reviewing messages while coffee brewed exactly the way he liked it. Yet something in him had shifted, subtle enough that no one would notice, except that his attention drifted, lingering where it never had before, catching small details that had once blended into the background. The sound of a door closing softly, the faint rhythm of cleaning tools moving down the hall, the presence of someone working not for recognition, but because the work needed to be done. And when Victor passed through the corridor and saw Elena standing at the sink, sleeves rolled neatly, focused entirely on her task, he slowed without realizing it, not to speak, not to interrupt, but to observe, noticing the careful way she aligned items after washing them, the way she checked her reflection briefly in the darkened glass of a cabinet before stepping away, as if reminding herself who she was allowed to be here, and for reasons he could not yet name. Victor felt a weight settle behind his ribs, not guilt exactly, but awareness, the kind that made comfort feel undeserved. And Elena sensed him only when his shadow crossed the floor, instinctively straightening, stepping aside to give him space, murmuring a polite greeting without lifting her eyes, because that was the rule she followed with everyone. And Victor nodded in return, his voice calm, professional, saying nothing more. But as he walked on, the house felt different to him, no longer just a symbol of success, but a place sustained by quiet effort, and somewhere between the polished floors and the silence that followed him, Victor Callahan realized that the woman he had never truly seen was now impossible to ignore. Victor Callahan had learned long ago how to move through the world without hesitation, his life structured by decisions made quickly and enforced quietly. And by mid-morning, he was already seated in the back of a black sedan rolling through the city, reviewing financial summaries while buildings passed like background scenery, his attention fixed on numbers that bent to his will, because power, to Victor, had always been something measurable, something you could calculate in percentages, square footage, and the tone people used when they said your name. And for years that had been enough, his days flowing seamlessly from meetings to phone calls to agreements that never required him to raise his voice. Yet even as he listened to updates and responded with calm authority, his thoughts kept drifting back to details that did not belong in spreadsheets. The quiet rhythm of footsteps in his hallway, the careful way Elena Brooks had stepped aside without being asked, the way her presence registered now not as background noise, but as proof of something he had ignored. And Victor frowned slightly as he realized how unfamiliar that feeling was, because he had built an empire on awareness of threats, loyalty, and opportunity, but never on awareness of people who existed beneath his notice. And when the car stopped, and he stepped into a private office overlooking the river, greeted by respectful nods and measured smiles, Victor resumed his role effortlessly, discussing timelines, approving budgets, and ending conversations with finality. Yet even here, surrounded by polished wood and muted confidence, the image of those unguarded moments lingered, not as accusation, but as interruption, a quiet disruption that refused to be dismissed. And he found himself watching the way assistants moved, how they waited for permission to speak, how they mirrored his posture unconsciously. And for the first time, Victor recognized the pattern, how power trained people to shrink, to anticipate, to erase themselves in order to survive. And that recognition unsettled him more than any hostile negotiation ever had, because it forced him to confront a truth he had never questioned, that his success had been built not only on ambition but on a system that thrived on invisibility. And when the meetings ended and the car carried him back toward the estate, Victor leaned back, phone resting heavy in his palm, resisting the urge to reopen that album, not because he feared what he would see, but because he feared what he would understand. And as the gates opened and the house came into view, immaculate and imposing against the afternoon light, he noticed how different it felt now, less like a fortress and more like a stage, every polished surface supported by unseen hands. And inside, Elena continued her work on the upper floor, adjusting curtains. To soften the glare of the sun, her movements precise, her mind focused on small tasks that gave her a sense of order, unaware that the man whose life she quietly maintained was now questioning the very foundation of his own authority. And when Victor entered the house, he paused briefly at the foot of the staircase, listening to the faint sounds above, the soft hum of effort that never asked for acknowledgement. And for a moment, he imagined what it would mean to live without being noticed, to have your value measured only by how little space you took up. And that thought stayed with him as he climbed the steps, not as guilt, but as a growing awareness that the power he wielded so easily had come at a cost he had never counted. And in that realization, Victor Callahan understood that his world had been carefully designed to protect him from seeing certain truths, and now that he had glimpsed one of them, there would be no returning to the comfort of not knowing. Later that evening, when the house settled into its familiar quiet and the last of the lights dimmed along the hallway, Victor Callahan returned to his study and closed the door behind him, not with urgency, but with intention, setting his phone on the desk as if it carried more weight than it should. And after standing there for a long moment, he picked it up again and opened the album he had avoided all afternoon, forcing himself to look without distraction, without rationalization, swiping slowly this time, noticing timestamps that formed a pattern he could not ignore, early mornings, late afternoons, brief pauses that aligned with shifts he had never bothered to learn. And as the images continued, he recognized locations within his own home, corners that security cameras did not cover, angles that suggested proximity rather than distance. And that realization sent a quiet unease through him, because Victor prided himself on systems that were deliberate, on processes that served a purpose. And yet these photographs existed outside of any plan he could recall, each one revealing a moment when Elena Brooks was simply existing, not performing, not working for approval, but resting, thinking, adjusting herself before stepping back into a role that required her to be smaller. And Victor's jaw tightened as he realized how easily those moments could have been dismissed, how often people like Elena were seen only in fragments, only when useful. And he paused on a photo taken near the laundry room. Elena standing by a window, sunlight catching the edge of her profile as she pressed her forehead lightly against the glass, eyes closed. The expression not dramatic, not sorrowful, but quietly human. And Victor felt something shift again, deeper this time, because that image reminded him of something he had buried years ago, a memory of waiting rooms and borrowed chairs, of his own mother standing near a window after long shifts, gathering herself before stepping back into a world that demanded more than it gave. And he exhaled slowly, realizing that these photos were not about surveillance or curiosity, but about recognition delayed too long, about a man who had unconsciously noticed a presence he had refused to acknowledge consciously. And as that truth settled in, Victor understood that the problem was not that the images existed, but that they existed without intention, without accountability. And that realization made him uncomfortable in a way power never had, because it forced him to confront the distance between control and responsibility. And he looked around the room, at the carefully curated shelves and framed achievements, wondering how many times he had mistaken order for understanding. And downstairs, Elena finished her tasks and prepared to leave for the day, changing back into her street clothes with the same quiet efficiency, unaware that her ordinary moments had become the catalyst for an extraordinary reckoning. And as she stepped outside into the cooling air, Victor stood alone upstairs, phone still in hand, scrolling back to the beginning of the album one last time, not with judgment, not with denial, but with clarity, because he knew now that what he had discovered was not a violation to be ignored, nor a mistake to be erased without thought, but a mirror held up to the way he had lived. And in that silence, surrounded by images that asked nothing and yet demanded everything, Victor Callahan came to understand that the choice before him was not about the past, but about what kind of man he would be moving forward. And for the first time in years, That decision felt heavier than any deal he had ever made. Sleep did not come easily to Victor Callahan that night, and when it did, it was shallow and restless, filled not with threats or unfinished business, but with images that refused to organize themselves into neat conclusions. So by the time dawn crept through the narrow gap between the curtains, he was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing in particular while his mind replayed moments he had once dismissed as irrelevant. And as he rose and moved through the quiet house, the silence felt different now, heavier, as if it carried questions he had never allowed himself to ask. And while coffee brewed in the kitchen, Victor stood by the window watching the grounds outside, perfectly maintained, perfectly controlled, yet suddenly aware that order did not equal fairness, and that realization followed him through the morning, clinging to his thoughts during routine phone calls and brief conversations that once demanded his full attention. Because every familiar interaction now seemed filtered through a new lens, one that measured not efficiency but impact. And when Elena arrived, moving through the service entrance as she always did, Victor noticed the way she paused before stepping inside, as if preparing herself mentally for the hours ahead. And that small act unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could, because it revealed an inner world he had never considered, a private discipline forged through necessity rather than choice. And throughout the day, he found himself resisting old instincts, the urge to assert presence, to command attention, instead choosing to observe quietly, to let moments unfold without interference. And the longer he did so, the clearer it became that power had allowed him to exist without reflection, to benefit from systems he never questioned. And now that reflection was unavoidable, because he could no longer separate the comfort of his life from the labor that sustained it. And that understanding brought with it a discomfort he could not delegate or negotiate away. And as afternoon turned to evening, Victor returned to his study and sat alone again, phone resting face down on the desk, not as an object of temptation but as a reminder. And he considered options the way he always did, listing possibilities in his mind, confronting outcomes, weighing risks. Yet none of the familiar calculations applied here, because this was not a problem to be solved quietly or a mistake to be corrected with distance, but a matter of integrity, of acknowledging responsibility without expectation of reward. And that thought forced him to confront a deeper truth, that the hardest decisions were not the ones made in public view, but the ones that required restraint, humility, and change without recognition. And downstairs, Elena prepared to leave for the day, locking cabinets and checking her list one final time, unaware that her presence had disrupted a world carefully designed to exclude such disruptions. And when Victor heard the door close softly behind her, he remained seated, staring at the wall where light shifted slowly as the sun dipped lower, realizing that whatever choice he made next would define him more than any title ever had. Because for the first time, the question before him was not what he could do, but what he should do when no one was watching. And in that quiet, unguarded moment, Victor Callahan understood that power did not absolve him of responsibility. It demanded it, and the weight of that truth settled in, not as punishment, but as an invitation to become something better than he had been before. That night, memory came for Victor Callahan not as a sudden revelation but as a slow, persistent return, the kind that arrived when defenses were lowered and the mind finally admitted what it had avoided. And as he sat alone in the dim light of his study, he found himself thinking about a time long before tailored suits and guarded conversations, back when his world had been smaller, louder, and far less forgiving. Remembering his mother, Margaret Callahan, standing at a bus stop before sunrise with a thermos she had owned for years, her hands wrapped around it for warmth while she waited to be taken to another shift that would leave her exhausted by evening. And Victor remembered how she used to straighten her coat before stepping onto the bus, not because it needed it, but because dignity mattered to her, even when no one else seemed to care. And as those memories surfaced, they aligned too easily with the images he had seen of Elena Brooks, the same quiet preparation, the same unspoken resolve to face the day without complaint. And Victor felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with regret and everything to do with recognition, because he realized now that the woman he had reduced to routine was living a version of a life he once knew intimately. one he had promised himself he would never return to. And yet here it was, unfolding daily within his own walls. And he leaned back in his chair, eyes closed briefly, recalling evenings when his mother came home tired but never defeated, reminding him to do his homework at the kitchen table while she prepared a simple meal, telling him that work done honestly mattered, even if the world refused to acknowledge it. And Victor had listened then, absorbing those lessons without fully understanding them, carrying ambition forward while leaving empathy behind. And now, decades later, the distance between who he had become and where he came from felt impossible to ignore, because Elena was not a symbol or a reminder by choice. She was simply a person doing her job with care, and it was Victor who had failed to see the humanity he once depended on. And as the clock ticked softly on the wall, he considered how easily success had insulated him, how it had allowed him to forget the invisible labor that built lives quietly while others took credit. And downstairs, Elena prepared her schedule for the next day, folding her uniform neatly and setting out clothes for the morning, her thoughts focused on practical concerns like bus times and grocery lists, unaware that her presence had unlocked a reckoning she would never be asked to explain. And Victor found himself wondering how many times his mother had been overlooked, how often she had stood in rooms where people spoke around her as if she were furniture, and the thought unsettled him deeply, because he knew he had benefited from her endurance while offering little acknowledgement in return. And now, faced with a parallel he could not dismiss, Victor understood that the past was not haunting him to punish him, but to guide him, to remind him of values that had been buried under layers of control and convenience. And as he opened his eyes and looked around the room once more, Victor Callahan recognized that this moment was not about correcting a single oversight, but about honoring a lineage of quiet strength he had nearly forgotten. And in that understanding, he felt the shape of his next decision taking form, not as an act of charity, but as a necessary alignment between who he was and who he had been taught to be, knowing that whatever came next would need to reflect that truth, even if no one else ever noticed. The decision Victor Callahan made did not arrive with ceremony or announcement, but with a series of quiet actions that unfolded over the next few days, deliberate and precise, as if he were correcting a structure that had been misaligned for years. And early one morning, before Elena Brooks arrived, Victor sat at his desk reviewing documents that had nothing to do with profit margins or expansion plans, but everything to do with accountability, reading through internal policies he had never personally examined, noticing gaps that allowed comfort for some and strain for others. And he made notes without emotion, adjusting language, clarifying expectations, ensuring that dignity was not an afterthought but a requirement. And when Elena arrived later that morning, she sensed nothing unusual at first, because Victor did not summon her, did not speak to her directly, did not change his demeanor in ways that would draw attention. And that restraint was intentional, because he understood now that true respect did not require an audience. And throughout the day, changes began to surface quietly, a maintenance request completed without delay, a schedule adjusted to allow consistent breaks, equipment replaced without question, small details that reduced strain rather than announcing generosity. And Elena noticed them with cautious curiosity, not assuming kindness, but appreciating the absence of difficulty, because years of experience had taught her that comfort was often temporary. And Victor continued observing from a distance, ensuring that adjustments did not single her out or make her visible in ways that felt unsafe. And later that week, he addressed his staff collectively, not with accusations or lectures, but with clear expectations, speaking about standards and boundaries, with a tone that allowed no misunderstanding, emphasizing that respect was not negotiable and that roles did not determine worth. And the room remained silent as his words settled, because Victor Callahan had never spoken that way before, and the shift was unmistakable. And that evening, alone once more in his study, Victor opened his phone and navigated to the album that had started it all, scrolling through the images slowly, not with guilt or nostalgia, but with resolve. And one by one, he removed them, not out of fear or shame, but because they no longer belonged there, because those moments were never meant to be collected or stored. And when the folder was empty, he closed it and set the phone aside, feeling a sense of finality that surprised him, not because something was lost, but because something had been corrected. And downstairs, Elena finished her shift and prepared to leave, pausing briefly by the door as she often did, taking a breath before stepping back into the world outside. And she noticed that the house felt lighter, not because it had changed dramatically, but because it no longer pressed against her the way it once had, and she could not explain why, but she felt it in the way her shoulders relaxed as she walked to her car, and Victor watched from an upper window, unseen, not with ownership or scrutiny, but with quiet acknowledgement, understanding that the most important choices were not the ones that reshaped others, but the ones that reshaped himself. And as the days passed, the changes held steady, not fading with novelty, not reverting with convenience, because Victor had committed to something deeper than correction. He had committed to awareness, and in doing so, he learned that power could be exercised not only through command, but through restraint, not only through visibility, but through respect practiced consistently. And in that realization, Victor Callahan discovered that the choice he made did not diminish him, it defined him, quietly, completely, and without the need for recognition. In the weeks that followed, the changes settled into Elena Brooks's routine so gently that she almost doubted they were real, because nothing had been announced and no explanations were offered. Yet the rhythm of her days began to feel different in ways she could not easily name, starting with small things that mattered more than anyone realized, like supplies that were always stocked before she ran out, tools that no longer jammed or slowed her down, and a schedule that respected the limits of a human body rather than testing them. And Elena noticed that she no longer felt the familiar tension in her shoulders by mid-afternoon, the kind that came from rushing to meet expectations that were never clearly defined. And as she moved through the house now, there was a subtle sense of space, not physical distance, but emotional room to breathe, and she found herself pausing less often to listen for footsteps or raised voices, because the environment no longer demanded constant vigilance. And that absence of pressure changed her in ways she did not anticipate, making her movements more confident, her posture a little straighter, her presence steadier. And when she caught her reflection in a hallway mirror one afternoon, she lingered for a moment, not out of vanity, but curiosity, noticing how her expression had softened, how her eyes no longer carried the same guarded fatigue. And she felt a quiet gratitude she did not know where to place, because nothing specific had happened. And yet everything felt more manageable, and she carried that feeling with her outside the estate as well, walking to her car at the end of each day with less weight on her mind, driving home with music playing softly instead of silence, and allowing herself small comforts she had once denied, like stopping for a warm meal instead of rushing straight home. And while Elena adapted gradually to this new normal, Victor Callahan observed from a distance, ensuring consistency rather than praise, making certain that the standards he had set held firm even when he was not present, and he resisted the impulse to frame his actions as generosity, because he understood now that fairness was not a gift, it was a responsibility long overdue. And one evening, as Elena prepared to leave, Victor happened to pass through the foyer at the same time, their paths crossing briefly, and she offered a polite nod as she always had. But this time, Victor returned it with a quiet acknowledgement that felt different, not heavy, not scrutinizing, just respectful. And Elena felt it immediately, not as attention, but as recognition, the kind that affirmed her existence without demanding anything in return. And she drove away that night feeling lighter than she had in years, unaware of the internal work that had led to this shift, but deeply aware of its impact. And days turned into weeks, and the sense of stability held, reinforcing her belief that perhaps she did not need to brace herself constantly for disappointment. And that belief allowed her to invest more of herself in the present, to plan ahead, to think beyond survival and toward possibility. And Victor watched these changes quietly, understanding that the true measure of his decision was not his own peace of mind, but the sustained dignity it restored to someone else. And as the estate continued to function smoothly, supported by labor that was now treated with intention rather than indifference, Victor recognized that the absence of spectacle did not lessen the significance of what had occurred, because the most meaningful outcomes were often invisible to everyone except those who lived with their effects every day. And in that quiet continuity, Elena Brooks experienced something she had rarely known in her working life, a sense of safety rooted not in promises, but in consistent respect, and though she would never know the full story behind the changes, she felt their truth in the way her days unfolded without fear, and that, more than any explanation, was enough. The final shift of the season arrived with a calm that felt earned, the kind that came not from absence of work, but from balance restored. And as evening settled over the Callahan estate, Victor stood by the window of his study watching the light fade across the grounds, the familiar view unchanged and yet entirely different to him now, because what he saw was no longer a monument to control, but a living place sustained by care. And downstairs, Elena Brooks completed her last tasks of the day, with an ease she had not known when she first arrived months ago, moving through rooms that now felt neutral rather than hostile, returning tools to their places, checking lists that had grown shorter as systems improved, and when she finished, she paused briefly, taking in the quiet, allowing herself a moment of stillness that no longer felt borrowed, and Victor heard the soft closing of a door and knew she was leaving, not because he tracked her movements, but because he had learned the rhythm of the house in a new way, one that acknowledged people rather than erased them, and he remained where he was, not calling out, not offering words that would shift the balance he had worked to protect, because he understood now that dignity did not require explanation, it required consistency. And as Elena walked toward her car, the evening air cool against her skin, she felt a sense of closure she could not quite explain, a quiet confidence rooted not in gratitude, but in self-respect. And she drove away with the knowledge that she would return the next day, not as someone bracing herself, but as someone allowed to exist without fear. And Victor stayed at the window until her car disappeared beyond the gate, reflecting on how easily the world rewarded noise and spectacle while overlooking the power of restraint. And he thought of his mother again, of the lessons she taught without speeches, of the way she lived with integrity even when no one applauded. And he realized that the most meaningful change he had made was not visible on any ledger or report, because it had taken place within him, reshaping how he understood authority and responsibility. And as the house settled into silence, Victor turned off the lights and left the study, moving through halls that no longer felt like corridors of dominance, but shared spaces defined by mutual respect. And upstairs, he placed his phone on the nightstand without thought, no longer burdened by what it contained or represented, because the reckoning it had sparked was complete. And in the days that followed, life continued. Without disruption, contracts signed, meetings held, work completed, yet beneath it all, a standard had been set that did not waver, because Victor had learned that power, when exercised without humility, hollowed both the giver and the receiver, and that real strength lay in the willingness to change quietly and permanently. And Elena continued her work with steadiness and pride, unaware of the full journey that had led to this moment, but fully aware of its outcome. And the world beyond the estate remained loud and indifferent. But within those walls, something essential had been corrected, and that correction endured, not because it was enforced, but because it was chosen. And in that choice, made without witnesses and sustained without praise, the true measure of dignity revealed itself, calm, unspoken, and undeniable.